The airline agent barely looked up from her computer screen when she spoke, her voice sharp and tired, like she had already decided this conversation wasn't worth her time. Name. Lily Carter tightened her grip on the strap of her backpack, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. Lily Carter. My flight was canceled last night, and The woman's fingers clacked against the keyboard, expression indifferent as she scanned the screen. A few moments passed, then a sigh. Your ticket was economy, non-refundable. If you want a seat on another flight, you'll have to purchase a new one at the current fare. Lily felt her pulse spike. I don't have any money left. The woman didn't react, didn't even glance at her. Next, the businessman behind her let out an impatient sigh and stepped forward, his expensive leather bag knocking into her side as he shoved past. Lily barely noticed. Her body had gone stiff, her brain stuck on the single, crushing realization that settled into her chest like a weight. She was stranded. She had spent the last 24 hours at Heathrow Airport, curled in a corner near the International Departures Board, watching people move past her in a blur of motion. She had checked the screens obsessively, hoping something would change. It hadn't. And now, standing here at the counter, with nothing left and nowhere to go, she felt it sink in for real. She turned too quickly, her exhaustion catching up with her, and she crashed into someone. A hand caught her arm before she could stumble, steadying her. Whoa, you all right? She muttered a distracted, sorry, trying to pull away, but the voice, steady, warm, cut through the fog in her head. She looked up and froze. Tom Cruise. For a second, her brain refused to process it. He was standing right in front of her, dressed casually in a dark jacket and jeans, sunglasses pushed onto his head. He wasn't surrounded by a security team, wasn't moving with the rushed urgency of someone avoiding attention. He was just there, looking at her. His assistant, a tall man in a press suit with an earpiece nestled in his ear, stepped forward immediately, his tone low but firm. Sir, we need you. Tom lifted a hand, cutting him off without breaking eye contact with Lily. You okay? She opened her mouth to say yes, the automatic response, the thing she had trained herself to say no matter how bad things were. But for some reason, maybe because she was too exhausted to pretend, maybe because no one else had asked, she told the truth. I don't know. Tom's eyes flicked to the airline counter, where the agent had already dismissed her like she didn't exist. Something shifted in his expression. Then, without hesitation, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and tore it in half. The sound of tearing paper was small, but it might as well have been an explosion. His assistant paled. The businessman from earlier, now handing his passport to the agent, turned and gawked. A flight attendant near the boarding gate whispered something under her breath. Tom held out the torn pieces of his ticket and handed them to his stunned assistant. Cancel my flight. The assistant's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Sir, what? You. Tom didn't even look at him. His attention was still on Lily. Come on. Lily's feet didn't move. What? Tom tilted his head toward the terminal exit. We're fixing this. She felt everything inside her stall, her body refusing to catch up to what was happening. You don't even know me. He shrugged. Didn't stop me before? Then he turned and started walking. Lily hesitated. Her instincts screamed that this was insane, that she didn't know him, that this wasn't real, that any second now she would wake up on the cold tile floor near Gate 14, where she had been all night, and none of this would have happened. But for reasons she couldn't explain, she followed. They walked in silence through the terminal, past passengers who barely glanced at them, past employees who greeted Tom with quick, professional nods. Lily had expected someone to stop them, expected security to appear out of nowhere and demand an explanation for why a 15-year-old girl with nothing but a battered backpack was suddenly walking through the airport with Tom Cruise. But no one did. No one even looked at her. It was like, just by being near him, she had disappeared, absorbed into whatever world he moved through, where things shifted without friction, where people made space for him without question. His assistant kept pace beside them, still in disbelief. Sir, you have a schedule. The meeting, the studio, they're expecting you in New York. Tom didn't break stride. They can wait. The assistant inhaled sharply, clearly trying to keep his frustration in check. You don't have to do this. Tom glanced sideways at him. Maybe I do. Lily couldn't keep up with any of this. She had been invisible for 24 hours, ignored, dismissed, treated like an inconvenience, and now she was walking toward an answer she didn't even know existed. They stopped at a private ticket counter near the executive lounge. The woman behind the desk straightened immediately when she saw Tom, her voice smooth, polite. Mr. Cruz, how can I help you? I need a first-class ticket to New York. Of course, sir. She started typing immediately. And one for her. Lily's stomach dropped. Wait. Tom looked at her like he had already decided. You need a flight home. I'm getting you one. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. I can't take that. He raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because she struggled for the right word. It's too much. Tom exhaled, shaking his head like he had expected this. It's a plane ticket, not a kidney. She clenched her fists at her sides, her entire body tense. I don't want to owe you. You don't. His voice was steady. You don't owe me anything. The ticket agent printed the boarding passes, sliding them across the counter. Tom took them without hesitation, handing one to Lily. Let's go. She stared at it, the weight of the paper pressing against her fingers. She could say no. She could walk away. She had spent so long figuring things out on her own, convincing herself she didn't need anyone, because needing people meant disappointment. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had made a choice that wasn't about them. And for reasons she still didn't understand, she didn't let go of the ticket. Tom turned toward the gate, boarding pass in hand. Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second before following, stepping into something she didn't understand yet. They walked through the jet bridge in silence, Lily gripping the strap of her backpack so tightly her fingers ached. Every step forward felt unreal, like she was moving through a space that wasn't meant for her, a reality she had somehow stepped into by accident. The moment they reached the entrance of the plane, a flight attendant immediately straightened, her expression shifting the second she recognized Tom. Her voice was smooth, professional, but with an unmistakable edge of excitement beneath it. Mr. Cruz, welcome aboard. Tom nodded casually, stepping inside like he had done this 1,000 times before. The flight attendant's gaze flicked to Lily for a brief second, but she didn't ask any questions, just gave her the same polite smile before turning to guide them toward their seats. Lily expected them to stop in business class, maybe even near the front of economy, but they kept walking past the curtains, past the first few rows of oversized seats, until they reached the section that barely even looked like an airplane anymore. First class. Lily had never been in a place like this, where the seats were more like personal lounges, spaced so far apart that privacy wasn't just an afterthought, but something built into the design. There were no cramped rows, no overhead bins crammed full of too many bags, no irritated sighs from passengers adjusting their knees because the seats were too tight. Everything was quiet, deliberate, like the entire world outside had been left behind. Tom slid into his seat without hesitation, setting his carry-on beside him and stretching slightly before glancing at her. You gonna sit? Lily stood stiffly for a second before lowering herself into the seat next to him, the leather cold against her hands as she adjusted her backpack on her lap. She had spent the last 24 hours sitting on the hard airport floor, curled against a pillar near the departures board, trying to keep herself from falling apart. Now she was here, in a seat so big she could pull her knees up if she wanted to, in a cabin where the flight attendants whispered when they spoke, where nothing felt real. A new flight attendant approached, another woman with a sleek uniform and perfect posture. Can I offer you a drink before takeoff, Mr. Cruz? Tom shook his head. I'm good, thanks. The woman turned to Lily. For a second, she hesitated, clearly unsure how to address her, like she was waiting for confirmation that she should even be here. And for you. Lily opened her mouth, hesitated, then cleared her throat. Water, please. The flight attendant nodded and disappeared down the aisle. Tom smirked slightly, adjusting his seatbelt. You nervous? Lily inhaled, pressing her lips together. No. He raised an eyebrow, like he didn't quite believe her, but he didn't push. Instead, he leaned back, glancing out the window as the last few passengers settled into their seats. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure time, but Lily barely heard it. She was still stuck in her own head, still trying to figure out what came next. The flight attendant returned, setting a glass of water on the tray table in front of her before moving away. Lily reached for it, but her hands were shaking slightly, the exhaustion creeping in now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She gripped the glass tighter, forcing herself to steady it. Tom noticed. When was the last time you ate? She stiffened slightly, glancing at him. I don't know. He nodded once, then reached for the menu on his tray table, flipping it open without looking at her. Order something. I'm not hungry. He didn't look up. That wasn't the question. Lily pressed her lips together, staring at the menu but not really reading it. The idea of food made her stomach twist, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she wasn't used to accepting things like this. She had spent too long scraping by, figuring things out on her own, going without when she had to. Sitting here, looking at a menu where every dish sounded expensive, knowing that none of it was hers to pay for, made her feel exposed in a way she didn't like. Tom sighed, flipping the menu shut and setting it aside. Fine. I'll order for you. Lily immediately tensed. I can do it myself. Then do it. She clenched her jaw, grabbing the menu and scanning it quickly before picking the first thing that didn't sound too complicated. A flight attendant returned a moment later, and before Lily could change her mind, she ordered. Tom did the same, leaning back in his seat like he had already won. The plane started moving, the slow, steady roll toward the runway, and she felt her breath catch slightly as the engines rumbled beneath them. The pressure built, the cabin vibrating softly as they gained speed, and then, in one smooth motion, they lifted off the ground. Tom glanced at her again. Still not nervous? She exhaled, gripping the armrest. I don't mind flying. He smirked but didn't say anything else. The plane leveled out, the hum of the engine settling into a steady background noise. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, adjusting things, preparing for meal service. Lily leaned her head back against the seat, staring up at the ceiling, trying to let the exhaustion take over, but her mind wouldn't stop. Tom shifted beside her, adjusting his armrest before glancing at her again. You got family waiting for you in New York? She hesitated. Not really. He didn't react, just studied her for a moment before nodding slightly. What's your plan? She looked away, fingers tapping lightly against her knee. I don't know yet. Tom exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Then maybe it's time to figure it out. Lily felt something heavy settle in her chest. She had spent the last 24 hours trapped in that airport, trying to get somewhere she wasn't even sure she belonged, trying to move forward without knowing what was ahead. Now she was here, in a place she never expected to be, sitting next to someone she never thought she would meet, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving, she was being given a chance to breathe. She didn't know what would happen when they landed. She didn't know if this was just a moment, just a strange, impossible thing that had happened to her, or if it was the start of something she hadn't even considered. But right now, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. And that was something. Lily stared at the tray in front of her, the plate set neatly in the middle, the food arranged too perfectly, like it was designed more for presentation than eating. She had picked something simple, something that wouldn't make her feel like she was taking too much. But even now, sitting in first class with a meal in front of her, it didn't feel real. She gripped the fork tightly, her stomach twisting at the thought of eating while sitting next to Tom Cruise, on a plane she hadn't paid for, heading toward a city where she had no real place to go. Tom cut into his own food without hesitation, taking a bite and chewing with the kind of ease that made it clear this was just another flight to him, just another moment in his life where everything moved around him without resistance. He didn't glance at her, didn't push her to eat, didn't acknowledge her hesitation at all, and somehow, that made it easier. She picked up her fork and took a bite, chewing slowly, waiting for the weight of guilt to settle in her stomach. It didn't. Tom glanced at her plate, then at her. Not bad, right? She nodded, swallowing. Better than airport food. He smirked slightly, taking another bite before leaning back. So, what's the plan when we land? Lily tensed slightly, her grip tightening on her fork. I don't know. Tom set his silverware down, wiping his hands on a napkin before tilting his head slightly. Where were you supposed to go? She exhaled, staring at her plate. My mom's place. He nodded, waiting. She hesitated, pushing her food around with her fork. But she's not expecting me. Tom's expression didn't change, but his posture did, just the smallest shift, like he had just confirmed something he had already suspected. You mean she doesn't know you're coming? Lily exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to answer. Yeah. Tom leaned back, stretching his arms before resting them against the armrests. What happened? She didn't know how much to say, didn't know if she even wanted to explain, but it didn't matter. He was waiting, and for some reason, she didn't want to lie. I was living with my dad. Things got complicated. He left. I was supposed to stay with my mom, but then she stopped answering my messages. I don't even know if she's home. Tom nodded slowly, absorbing her words without reacting. So when you got to the airport, you didn't even know if you had a place to go. Lily swallowed hard. Pretty much. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked out the window like he was thinking. Then, without warning, he pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket, unlocked it, and started typing something. Lily frowned. What are you doing? He didn't look up. Figuring something out. Her stomach twisted. I don't need. I know. His voice was calm, steady. I'm doing it anyway. She watched him for a moment, unsure what to do, unsure if she should stop him, but part of her was too exhausted to argue. She had spent too long trying to figure everything out on her own, too long waiting for someone to answer her messages, too long pretending she could handle things when she was barely keeping it together. Maybe, just this once, she could let someone else figure it out for her. Tom slid his phone back into his pocket, looking at her again. When we land, you're not just walking into a situation you don't know. I'm getting you a place to stay, at least for the next few days. No arguments. Lily inhaled sharply, her mind scrambling for something to say. You don't owe me anything. She clenched her jaw, her fingers curling into the fabric of her hoodie. I don't want pity. Good, Tom said easily. Because I don't do pity. She looked away, staring at the seat in front of her, her chest tight. I've been figuring things out on my own for a long time. He exhaled. Yeah, I get that. Lily frowned. No offense, but I don't think you do. Tom let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You'd be surprised. She turned toward him, skeptical. When have you ever been stranded in an airport with no money? He smirked, tilting his head slightly. Not an airport, but I've been stuck before. No money, no place to go, no backup plan. She studied him, searching for a hint of exaggeration, but his face was unreadable. When? He leaned back in his seat, exhaling. Before I was anyone. Before I had anything. I had a dream that didn't make sense, no support, and a whole lot of people telling me I was going to fail. There was a point where I didn't know what I was going to do next, but then someone stepped in, helped me when they didn't have to. They didn't ask questions, didn't make me explain myself. They just helped. Lily swallowed. And you never saw them again? Tom shook his head. Nope. She hesitated. Did you ever try to find them? He smiled slightly, but there was something else there, something she couldn't quite place. No. I think that was the point. Lily sat quietly, letting his words settle in. She didn't know why this was happening, didn't know why out of everyone in that airport, he had chosen to help her. But now she understood, this wasn't about her. This was about something else, something that had happened long before today, something he had never let go of. She exhaled, staring down at her hands. I still don't get it. Tom turned his head slightly. Get what? Why me? He was quiet for a second before answering. Because I was you once. Lily didn't speak, couldn't speak, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the only one who understood what it felt like to be completely alone. She had spent too long convincing herself that no one cared, that no one would ever step in, that she would always have to fight through things by herself. But for the first time in her life, someone had stopped. Someone had stayed. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know where this was leading. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence between them. Lily stared at the empty plate in front of her, the food now gone, but her mind wasn't any quieter. She had spent the last few hours trying to make sense of everything, trying to figure out what was supposed to happen next, but nothing about this situation followed any logic she understood. Tom Cruise had torn up his own boarding pass, changed his entire schedule, and now he was sitting next to her on a flight, arranging a place for her to stay like this was something normal, like he did things like this all the time. She had spent too long being ignored, being brushed aside by people who didn't want to deal with her problems, and now she was here, with someone who had no reason to care but did anyway. Tom checked his phone again, scanning whatever message had just come through, then slipped it back into his pocket before glancing at her. Hotel's taken care of. You'll have a room when we land. Lily inhaled, her fingers tightening on the fabric of her hoodie. I didn't ask for that. I know. She swallowed. I still don't get why you're doing this. Tom stretched his arms slightly, adjusting his seat before answering. I already told you. Because someone did it for me once. Lily's stomach twisted, not because she didn't believe him, but because she didn't know how to accept something like this. You don't even know me. Tom exhaled, watching her carefully. Do I need to? She hesitated, trying to find the right words, but her thoughts were a mess. People don't do things like this. He smirked slightly. Most people don't. Lily clenched her jaw, turning away to stare out the window. I don't want to be your charity project. Tom didn't react, didn't seem offended, just studied her like he understood exactly why she was saying this. You're not. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. Then what am I? Tom leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on his knees. Someone who needs a break. She turned back toward him, her expression guarded. And you're just giving me one? He shrugged. Why not? Lily had no answer for that. Tom sat back again, shifting in his seat, his voice lighter when he spoke. You think too much. Lily let out a small, sharp breath. Maybe because none of this makes sense. He smiled slightly. Maybe it doesn't have to. She shook her head, pressing her fingers against her temples. I don't know how to do this. Do what? She motioned vaguely between them. This. Just accepting things. Letting people help. It's not how my life works. Tom nodded slowly, like that wasn't surprising at all. Yeah, it wasn't how mine worked either. Lily studied him, trying to figure him out, trying to understand why he wasn't like every other person she had met, why he wasn't acting like she was a problem to be solved, why he wasn't treating her like a burden. So what changed? Tom leaned his head back against the seat, his gaze unfocused for a second. I did. She frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. For a long time, I thought the only way to get anywhere was to do everything alone. Didn't trust people, didn't think anyone really cared. Then someone proved me wrong. Took me a while to accept it, but once I did, everything changed. Lily bit the inside of her cheek. And now you just do the same thing? Tom smirked. Not always. She narrowed her eyes slightly. So why now? He was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Because you remind me of me. Lily felt something in her chest tighten, something she wasn't ready to deal with, something she had spent too long avoiding. She had spent her whole life convincing herself that no one understood, that no one would ever see her, that she would always have to fight to exist in spaces where she wasn't wanted. And now here was someone who didn't owe her anything, who had no reason to even notice her, saying he saw something in her that was familiar. She swallowed, her voice quieter now. You don't even know what I've been through. Tom met her gaze, his voice steady. I don't have to. She looked down at her hands, at the small scars on her knuckles, at the faint bruises left from too many days of carrying everything alone. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Tom didn't hesitate. Figure out what you want. Lily let out a breath, shaking her head slightly. I don't even know where to start. Tom nodded like that was an answer he had expected. That's what the hotel is for. You're not figuring it out in an airport, and you're not figuring it out on the streets. You're taking a few days, getting some sleep, eating real food, and then you decide what comes next. Lily rubbed a hand over her face, exhaustion creeping in again. And if I don't know what comes next? Tom shrugged. Then you take more time. She let that sit for a moment, staring down at the small tray table in front of her, at the half-empty glass of water, at the remnants of a meal she wouldn't have had if he hadn't stepped in. She wanted to fight it, wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need any of this. But she couldn't. Because she did. She exhaled slowly. I don't want to waste this. Tom smiled slightly, shifting in his seat. Then don't. Lily let her head fall back against the seat, her eyes slipping shut, the weight of everything pressing down on her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't running, wasn't fighting, wasn't bracing for the next thing to go wrong. For the first time, she felt like she could stop. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone after all. The plane had been in the air for hours, the flight attendants moving through the cabin in near silence, refilling drinks, adjusting trays, making sure the passengers were comfortable. Lily hadn't spoken in a while, her thoughts tangled up in everything that had happened, everything that was still happening. She had expected reality to snap back into place at some point, for something to go wrong, for this entire situation to turn out to be some kind of misunderstanding. But it hadn't. She was still here, sitting next to Tom Cruise on a flight she hadn't paid for, heading toward a city where she had no clear plan, no guarantee of what came next. And somehow, instead of panicking about it, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to fall apart this time. Tom glanced at her, adjusting his seat slightly. You still awake? She nodded, rubbing her fingers against her temples. Yeah. He reached for his drink, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. What are you thinking? Lily exhaled, staring straight ahead. That I don't know what's waiting for me when we land. Tom nodded, like that answer made perfect sense. You're not supposed to. She turned toward him, her expression guarded. That doesn't freak you out? Tom smirked slightly. It used to. Lily hesitated, studying him carefully. And now? He leaned back, resting one arm against the side of his seat. Now I know that sometimes the best things happen when you don't have a plan. She frowned, looking away. That sounds like something people say when they already have everything figured out. Tom laughed under his breath, shaking his head. You think I have everything figured out? She shrugged, tapping her fingers against her knee. You're Tom Cruise. He chuckled, like the answer amused him. That doesn't mean anything. Lily narrowed her eyes slightly. You don't think people see you that way? Tom exhaled, glancing toward the window. People see what they want to see. Lily sat with that for a moment, letting the words settle in. And what do you see? Tom's expression shifted, turning serious in a way she hadn't expected. I see someone who's been fighting for too long. She swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. I didn't have a choice. He nodded. I know. She looked away, her voice quieter now. I don't know how to stop. Tom didn't hesitate. Then you take it one step at a time. Lily inhaled sharply, her chest tightening. What if I screw it up? Tom smirked slightly. Then you try again. She let out a breath, shaking her head. You make it sound easy. Tom smiled. It's not. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. Lily stared down at her hands, fingers curled into her hoodie. I don't want to waste this. Tom tilted his head slightly. Then don't. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. And if I do? Tom leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then you figure out what went wrong and you do it differently next time. Lily clenched her jaw, the weight of everything pressing down on her. I don't even know where to start. Tom nodded like that was the most natural thing in the world. Then you start with whatever's right in front of you. She let out a small, sharp breath. And what's in front of me right now? Tom smiled slightly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. A hotel room, some actual sleep, and a few days to figure it out. Lily stared at him for a long moment, searching his expression, waiting for some kind of catch, some hidden condition that she hadn't noticed yet. But there wasn't one. He wasn't offering a solution, wasn't giving her some perfect, easy way out. He was just giving her space to breathe, space to stop fighting long enough to see what came next. She swallowed, looking down at her lap. You think this actually changes anything? Tom didn't hesitate. Yeah, I do. She rubbed a hand over her face, exhaustion creeping in again. I don't know how to just. Let someone help me. Tom exhaled, his voice softer now. Then maybe this is where you learn. Lily didn't respond, just sat there, staring down at her hands, the weight of everything settling in. She didn't know what was going to happen next, didn't know if she would wake up tomorrow feeling any different, any stronger, any more capable of handling whatever was waiting for her. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to figure it out alone. She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. For now, that was enough.